In 2015, during an opening ceremony that would mark a historic turning point for an entire nation, the head of Angola's railway bureau stood before a crowd and made a statement that captured global attention. He declared that perhaps nowhere else on Earth except China possessed the courage and capability to accomplish what had just been achieved. You might assume this was diplomatic flattery or ceremonial exaggeration, but consider the reality. Chinese engineers and construction teams had just completed a monumental undertaking that consumed an entire decade of their lives and required an investment of $1.88 billion. The result was a 1,344-kilometer railway line cutting through some of the most dangerous terrain on the African continent. Now here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. In China itself, a railway project of comparable length would typically reach completion and begin operations within 3 years, maybe 4 at most. So what made this particular project stretch across 10 full years? The answer lies buried beneath the soil. More than 6 million active landmines scattered along the entire route, deadly remnants of a brutal civil war that tore the country apart for decades. Many of these explosive devices remain undetonated to this very day. A single accidental detonation could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction with consequences beyond imagination. This lethal legacy is precisely why this railway had remained unfinished for over a century, despite multiple attempts to complete it. But this raises a compelling question. What motivated China to shoulder such an enormous risk to help Angola construct this railway? And perhaps more importantly, now that it's been operational for a full decade, what has this railway actually achieved for the people of Angola? If you find value in the stories we tell and the investigations we pursue, please subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming content. Now, let's dive deep into this remarkable story. To understand why this railway matters so profoundly, we first need to understand Angola itself. Angola occupies a strategic position along Africa's southwestern coast, where the continent meets the Atlantic Ocean. Geographically, it's sandwiched between the Democratic Republic of the Congo to the north and Namibia to the south. Its Atlantic coastline extends for more than 1,600 kilometers, providing the nation with invaluable access to maritime trade routes and positioning it as a potential regional shipping hub. But Angola's true wealth lies beneath its surface. The country stands as sub-Saharan Africa's second-largest oil producer, with petroleum reserves that have attracted international attention for decades. Beyond oil, Angola possesses diamond deposits that rank among the 10 largest in the world. These are resources that, in theory, should propel any nation toward prosperity and rapid economic development. Yet reality tells a different story. Despite sitting atop such abundant natural wealth and enjoying such favorable geographic positioning, Angola's economy remains dangerously narrow and vulnerable. The nation's entire GDP depends almost exclusively on oil exports. When global oil prices rise, the economy expands. When prices fall, the entire national economy contracts accordingly. This lack of economic diversification creates a perpetual cycle of instability. Of course, understanding Angola's development challenges requires looking at its transportation infrastructure, or rather, the lack of it. The country's economic potential was supposed to be unlocked by the Benguela Railway, a critical artery designed to connect the Atlantic coast with the resource-rich interior regions and beyond. But in 1975, when Angola's devastating civil war erupted, this vital railway became one of the first casualties. By the time peace finally returned in 2002, after 27 years of continuous conflict, the 1,344-kilometer line had been thoroughly destroyed. Worse still, the corridor along the entire route had become a minefield, quite literally. According to data compiled by international humanitarian organizations, more than 10 million landmines were planted throughout Angola during the war years. Along the Benguela Railway corridor alone, at least 6 million remained uncleared when the conflict ended. These weren't just statistics on paper. Each one represented a potential tragedy waiting to happen. So for Angola to genuinely restart its economy and move forward, the very first priority was clear: restore this war-torn, mine-infested railway that could reconnect the nation with itself and with the wider world. The Angolan government fully recognized this necessity. But recognizing a problem and solving it are two entirely different challenges, especially for a nation that had just emerged from nearly 3 decades of brutal civil conflict. Post-war Angola was economically devastated. The national treasury was essentially empty. The country's institutional capacity was barely functional. Forget about rebuilding an entire railway system. Many highways, agricultural lands, and even residential villages still had active landmines scattered across them, making basic reconstruction dangerous and complex. In this desperate situation, Angola's only realistic path forward was to seek international assistance. The government began reaching out to various countries and international organizations, hoping someone would step forward to help rebuild this critical infrastructure. Initially, Angola approached neighboring African countries and reached out to Western nations and corporations that had historically engaged with the continent. The logic seemed straightforward. Surely someone would see the value in helping rebuild such strategically important infrastructure in a resource-rich nation. But the response was almost universally negative. Not a single Western company or government was willing to take on the project. The reason, though disappointing for Angola, was coldly rational from a business perspective. Post-war Angola had virtually nothing to offer in terms of immediate returns. Its economy was in shambles. Its legal and regulatory frameworks were still being reconstructed. Its infrastructure, from roads to electricity grids, was largely non-functional. Rural regions remained dangerous due to unexploded ordnance. For any international company considering participation in the Benguela Railway reconstruction, the first massive obstacle would be dealing with millions of landmines left behind by decades of warfare. The cost of professional mine clearance would be astronomical. The timeline would be unpredictable at best. Liability concerns would be enormous. For Western corporations operating on profit-driven models, analyzing quarterly returns and shareholder value, such a project presented overwhelming risks with minimal short-term appeal. The potential payoff seemed too distant and too uncertain to justify the investment and danger. Facing rejection after rejection, the Angolan government began looking eastward toward China. From my research into this period, China in the early 2000s was experiencing its own transformation. The nation was in a phase of explosive economic growth and industrial expansion. Its infrastructure construction capabilities had developed to world-class levels through decades of massive domestic projects. Perhaps more significantly, China was actively seeking to expand its influence and partnerships throughout the African continent. What made China different from Western partners was its approach. Chinese development assistance didn't come packaged with political preconditions or demands for specific governance reforms. For Angola, which had just escaped a long civil war and desperately needed reconstruction without external interference in its internal affairs, this approach was invaluable. The Angolan government gradually came to a realization: if they genuinely wanted their country to recover and develop, China might not just be a potential partner, it might be their only truly viable partner. Starting in 2002, immediately after the Civil War's conclusion, Angolan government officials began making regular trips to Beijing, proactively engaging with Chinese banks, state-owned enterprises, and construction companies. These weren't just diplomatic courtesy calls. These were serious negotiations about Angola's future. By 2004, Angola formally proposed an innovative arrangement that came to be known as the Resources for Infrastructure or Oil-Backed Loans model. The concept was straightforward but transformative. Angola would use its future oil production as collateral to secure loans from Chinese financial institutions. In exchange, China would provide the technology, expertise, and construction capacity Angola desperately needed. This model offered compelling advantages for both nations. Angola didn't need to produce massive upfront cash payments it simply didn't have. China, for its part, secured access to a reliable, long-term energy supply to fuel its rapidly growing industrial economy. Both sides could achieve their strategic objectives through mutual cooperation rather than one-sided dependency. This win-win framework ultimately led to the signing of several major agreements between the two countries, with the reconstruction of the Benguela Railway positioned as the flagship project, a symbol of what this partnership could accomplish. But as we established earlier, the biggest challenge of rebuilding the Benguela Railway wasn't securing funding or deploying construction technology. The real nightmare was the millions of landmines buried along every kilometer of the route. Let me give you some context on the scale we're discussing. According to assessments by international demining organizations, approximately 6 million unexploded landmines remained along the 1,344-kilometer railway corridor. Do the mathematics. That's an average of more than 4,000 landmines for every single kilometer of track. Think about what this means in practical terms. Every step the Chinese construction teams took could potentially trigger an explosion. Every meter of ground broken, every foundation dug, every piece of earth moved carried lethal risk. To ensure worker safety, the project couldn't proceed like normal railway construction. Instead, specialized demining teams had to completely clear small sections, painstakingly verify their safety, and only then could construction workers move in to begin actual railway work. In many locations, the time required for mine clearance exceeded the time needed for the railway construction itself. A stretch of track measuring just a few dozen kilometers could require 6 months or even a full year of demining work before a single rail could be laid. International safety organizations designated this corridor as one of the most densely mined regions anywhere on Earth. Beyond the omnipresent threat of landmines, the natural environment along the Benguela Railway presented its own formidable challenges. The route traverses an extraordinary range of terrain, coastal plains, gradually rising into highlands, then cutting through mountain ranges, spanning deep gorges, and passing through vast expanses of tropical shrubland. Each terrain type brought unique engineering and safety complications. Daytime temperatures routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. That's over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This extreme heat didn't just make work physically exhausting for laborers, it dramatically shortened the operational lifespan of construction machinery and put workers at constant risk of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. During Angola's rainy season, the challenges multiplied. Heavy tropical downpours would completely halt construction activities. Flash flooding could wash away sections of track that had taken weeks to complete. Engineers had to design drainage systems capable of handling these seasonal deluges while ensuring the railway bed remained stable. Then there was the legacy of war itself. The railway corridor had been a major battlefield for decades. The entire route was littered with bomb craters and the ruins of destroyed buildings and infrastructure. In many sections, it was nearly impossible to discern where the original railway had even existed. Chinese workers couldn't simply begin laying new track. First, they had to clear away decades of war debris. Then they had to check for and safely remove or detonate unexploded ordnance beyond just landmines, artillery shells, unexploded bombs, and other dangerous remnants. Only after this could they rebuild the roadbed and establish proper drainage systems. When the route reached valleys, bridges had to be engineered and constructed. When mountains blocked the path, tunnels had to be excavated through solid rock. Only after completing all of this foundational work could workers finally lay down the sleepers and rails that would form the actual railway. Making matters even more complex, inland Angola at that time had virtually no industrial production capacity. This meant most construction materials, from concrete to steel rails to specialized equipment, had to be imported from other regions and transported to the construction sites. adding layers of logistical complexity and cost. To overcome these extraordinary obstacles, the Chinese engineering teams didn't just rely on determination and hard work. They deployed advanced technology and innovative methodologies specifically adapted to Angola's unique challenges. China provided cutting-edge mine detection equipment, blast-resistant protective suits for demining specialists, and plow-type mechanical demining machines that could clear vegetation and surface mines with reduced risk to human workers. They utilized mechanized mowing and excavation equipment to minimize the number of personnel who needed to enter potentially dangerous zones. Simultaneously, Chinese engineers conducted detailed studies of Angola's geological and environmental conditions. Before railway construction could begin anywhere along the route, the foundation had to be properly stabilized. Ordinary flat sections required asphalt paving and careful compaction. Areas with soft soil needed deep stone and sand pile foundations to increase load-bearing capacity and prevent subsidence. In the highland regions, engineers incorporated reinforced soil structures and constructed retaining walls to prevent deformation or collapse during railway operations, especially during heavy rains when soil saturation could compromise stability. The project required not just technical expertise, but also remarkable patience and cultural sensitivity. Chinese workers and engineers lived in Angola for years, working alongside local employees, training Angolan personnel, and gradually building the skills and knowledge base that would allow Angola to maintain and operate the railway independently. Finally, in 2014, after a full decade of continuous work, the entire 1,344-kilometer Benguela Railway was completely rebuilt. In February 2015, the railway officially opened for commercial operations. At the opening ceremony, the director of the Angola Railway Bureau delivered remarks that resonated far beyond the assembled crowd. His statement that perhaps only China in the entire world had the capability to complete such a railway wasn't empty praise. It was an acknowledgement of what had actually been accomplished against seemingly impossible odds. But, the real question isn't about the engineering achievement itself. The real question is, now that this railway has been operational for a full decade, what tangible benefits has it delivered to Angola and its people? Since opening in 2015, the Benguela Railway has operated continuously for 10 years. It successfully reconnected the Atlantic port of Lobito with Angola's resource-rich interior regions and established efficient connections extending into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, allowing valuable resources like manganese ore to flow to international markets. Since resuming international freight operations in 2018, the railway has transported over 360,000 tons of cargo. The economic impact has been dramatic. For example, the cost of transporting goods from Moxico Province, located in the eastern interior, dropped from over $1,000 per ton to just a few dozen dollars. When transportation costs plummet like this, the effects ripple throughout the entire regional economy. As goods became cheaper to move, prices in surrounding regions began falling, stimulating both agricultural production and retail commerce. Farmers could get their products to market economically. Retailers could stock their shelves at lower cost. Consumers could afford more goods. For ordinary Angolans, however, the railway's impact has been even more tangible and life-changing in ways that statistics struggle to capture. To date, the Benguela Railway has carried more than 4 million passengers. Travel time between major cities like Lobito and Benguela has been cut in half compared to road transport. Railway tickets cost less than bus fares, making travel both faster and more affordable for working-class families. This kind of convenient, affordable mobility is especially transformative for people who depend on part-time work, small trading businesses, or need to travel between cities for employment opportunities. Suddenly, economic possibilities that were previously out of reach became accessible. Perhaps even more interesting is what has organically developed around the railway stations themselves. Small informal markets have naturally emerged near many stations along the route. With increased foot traffic comes increased commercial opportunity. Street vendors selling food, clothes, and household goods have found steady customers. For many Angolans, these railway-adjacent markets represent their first real opportunity to establish a viable livelihood in the post-war era. Calling the Benguela Railway the lifeline of Angola's post-war reconstruction and economic recovery is not hyperbole. It's an accurate description of its function in the national economy. But this still leaves us with a question that deserves a thoughtful answer. Why did China take on this risk and make this investment to help Angola build this railway? To understand China's motivation, we need to look at the broader context of the early 2000s. China was experiencing unprecedented economic growth. Its industrialization was accelerating at a pace the world had rarely seen. This rapid industrial expansion created a surging demand for energy, particularly oil. At that time, the Middle East remained complicated and unpredictable. Political instability, regional conflicts, and the geopolitical tensions following the Iraq War made relying exclusively on Middle Eastern oil supplies a risky strategy for China's energy security. By comparison, crude oil from Africa's Atlantic coast offered several advantages. The quality was high. The shipping routes were more stable and secure, avoiding choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. And importantly, African nations were eager for the kind of development partnerships China was willing to offer. Under these circumstances, China made a strategic calculation: provide development loans to Angola, help rebuild critical infrastructure like the Benguela Railway, and in the process, establish a reliable, long-term energy partnership. It was a classic example of what international relations scholars call strategic patience, investing in relationship building with a long-term perspective rather than demanding immediate returns. This decision has proven remarkably successful. Today, Angola ranks among China's top 3 oil suppliers, providing a steady flow of energy that helps fuel Chinese industry and economic growth. But the relationship extends far beyond oil transactions. The Benguela Railway model, the Resources for Infrastructure framework, has demonstrated that this type of cooperation can be genuinely win-win, benefiting both partners in concrete, measurable ways. The Benguela Railway also needs to be understood within an even larger strategic framework, China's Belt and Road Initiative, formally announced in 2013. This ambitious initiative aims to reshape global economic networks by building infrastructure connections across continents, creating new trade routes, and fostering deeper economic integration between Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. For this vast economic vision to become reality, Africa is undeniably a crucial component. After all, Africa represents one of the world's most promising markets for future growth, yet it simultaneously remains one of the regions with the weakest infrastructure foundation. Whether we're discussing the Benguela Railway, the Tazara Railway connecting Tanzania and Zambia in East and Southern Africa, port construction projects, highway development, or telecommunications infrastructure, China's involvement can be observed across many of the major infrastructure projects Africa has undertaken in recent decades. This doesn't mean the relationships are without complications or criticisms. Questions about debt sustainability, environmental standards, labor practices, and long-term sovereignty concerns are legitimate topics of discussion and deserve careful consideration. But what cannot be denied is that infrastructure which had languished incomplete for decades or even a century is now being built. Railways that connect landlocked regions to ports are now operating. Roads that enable agricultural products to reach markets are now paved. For many African nations, these aren't abstract geopolitical considerations, they're concrete improvements in daily life. As we look back on the 10 years since the Benguela Railway's reopening, perhaps the most important question isn't about China's motivations or Angola's gratitude. Perhaps the most important question is what this project reveals about what's possible when nations commit to long-term cooperation despite enormous obstacles. Think about what was accomplished here. A railway corridor that had been deemed too dangerous, too expensive, and too complicated by virtually every other potential partner was successfully rebuilt. 6 million landmines didn't make the project impossible. They made it longer, harder, and more expensive, but not impossible. Engineers from a country thousands of kilometers away spent 10 years of their lives working in extreme heat, navigating linguistic and cultural differences, and quite literally risking their lives to build infrastructure for a nation that wasn't their own. The result is more than just 1,344 kilometers of railway track. It's millions of passengers who can now travel affordably between cities. It's hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo reaching international markets. It's small businesses emerging around railway stations. It's children who can visit relatives in other cities. It's economic possibilities that didn't exist a decade ago. Is the Benguela Railway a perfect solution to all of Angola's development challenges? Of course not. Infrastructure alone cannot solve complex issues of governance, economic diversification, or social inequality. But it is a foundation. It is a starting point. It is proof that progress is possible.